before the world had cities, before kings learned to carve their names into stone, before laws were written on tablets or sung in courts, the ground received blood. It is one of the most terrible quiet moments in Scripture. A field, two brothers, one living, one fallen, and then the voice of God breaking into human violence with a sentence that still startles by its severity and intimacy. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Genesis 4:10. The earth had already been cursed because of Adam's sin. Genesis 3:17. Now it must drink the blood of Adam's son. Sin has moved quickly. It was disobedience in a garden, then blame between husband and wife, then pain in childbirth, then toil in the field. Now it is murder. The first family has not grown old before it has learned how burial feels. Cain had been warned. The warning came before the blow, before the silence, before the body in the field. Sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Genesis 4:7. The image is almost unbearable in its patience. This is not described as a storm that falls without notice. It waits, it watches, it crouches. Cain is addressed as a moral agent, not a victim of impulse. He is told that the moment is still open. He does not take the opening. Abel's offering had risen from the firstborn of his flock and from their fat portions, and the Lord regarded Abel and his offering. Genesis 4:4. Cain also brought an offering from the fruit of the ground, but Genesis does not linger on the contents of his gift. It turns instead toward the posture of the giver. The New Testament will later say that Abel offered by faith, Hebrews 11:4. That line does not solve every mystery in the scene, but it brings the matter where Scripture wants it. Worship is never bare transaction. The altar does not hide the heart. Cain's face falls. The field becomes the place where inward rebellion turns outward. He speaks to Abel, and then Abel is gone. Pause there for a breath. The Bible does not decorate this moment. It does not multiply descriptions. It lets the simplicity of the act bear its own weight. A brother raises himself against a brother, and the first shared childhood becomes the first shattered one. The same mother who once received 2 sons from the Lord must now reckon with a household where one son has murdered another. The first parents who once heard the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day now hear him ask questions over blood. Where is Abel your brother? Genesis 4:9. Cain answers with the line that keeps returning wherever response is denied. I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Genesis 4:9. He does not merely lie. He resists the very shape of human duty. The question is small in length and vast in damage. It imagines a human life detached from obligation. It treats nearness as accident. It rejects the burden of care, yet Genesis itself answers Cain. Yes, in God's world, brother is not a passing category. Human beings are not loose stones lying near one another by chance. They belong, and belonging carries weight. From the first pages of Scripture, the human problem is not only that we fail God in private devotion, we fail one another in public life. The vertical wound and the horizontal wound arrive together. Then judgment comes. Cain will be cursed from the ground, the same ground that opened its mouth to receive Abel's blood from his hand. When he works the soil, it will no longer yield its strength to him. Genesis 4:11-12. This is exact judgment. Cain had lived by the field, and he violated his brother in the field. Now the field itself becomes witness against him. He will be a fugitive and a wanderer. That word wanderer matters. The story of Cain's wife cannot be understood without first hearing Cain's sentence. The question is never only, whom did he marry? It is also, what kind of man stood at the threshold of that marriage? What mark of memory entered the house with him? What sorrow sat down at his table before his children did? Cain hears the sentence and thinks immediately of vulnerability. Whoever finds me will kill me. Genesis 4:14. The fear is revealing. The world is not large yet, but it is already dangerous. Violence, once enacted, multiplies in imagination. Cain knows what a human hand can do because his own has already done it. And the Lord, in one of the strangest and most searching acts in Genesis, sets a sign upon Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Genesis 4:15. Scripture does not tell us the visible form of that mark. Many later claims have tried to fill the silence, and most have done violence to the text. Genesis refuses spectacle here. It gives function, not anatomy. The mark means protection. The murderer is judged, but he is not abandoned to human revenge. Justice does not disappear. Mercy does not disappear either. That tension will stay with Cain all his days. It will also stay with the reader. If the mark unsettles us, it is because it forces us to admit that God's judgments are never crude. He does not excuse Cain. He does not permit vengeance to become another lawless flood. He restrains one sinner even while sentencing another. The sentence carries sorrow. The protection carries sorrow too. Cain must live, and because he lives, the question follows him eastward with a Marxist. Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Genesis 4:16. Eastward is not merely a direction in Genesis, it becomes a moral geography. After Adam and Eve are sent from the garden, cherubim are placed at the east of Eden, Genesis 3:24. Cain goes farther east, exile acquires movement, distance becomes inheritance. The text says Cain went away from the presence of the Lord, not because God's sovereignty ended at a border, but because covenant nearness had been broken. Cain now lives in the world as a man who cannot return by his own strength. He bears a mark that both preserves and exposes him. Every morning he wakes under a mercy he did not deserve, and beneath a memory he cannot silence. This is where lesser readings rush too quickly toward the puzzle. They ask for a wife before they have understood a man. But Genesis does not offer curiosities detached from conscience. It leads us by wounds, by sentences, by names, by births, by graves. Cain's wife enters a story already charged with guilt, estrangement, protection, survival, and the first attempt to live beyond a crime that cannot be reversed. There is no hint in the text that Cain ceased to be human because he sinned. There is no hint that God's mark expelled him from the possibility of family life. Judgment does not make him less responsible. It makes his responsibilities heavier. To build any household east of Eden is already difficult. To build one as Cain is difficult in another order entirely. Stay with that image for a moment. A marked man walking away with enough breath left in him to father children. The line between punishment and continued vocation becomes visible. Here Cain will not recover Abel. He will not reverse the field. He will not step back into innocence. Yet he remains within a world where marriage, labor, and birth continue. The curse narrows him, but it does not erase the broader human commission first given to the man and the woman, to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth. Genesis 1:28. The blessing of human propagation outlives the first family's disaster, though it now moves through pain. That helps explain why Genesis can speak of Cain's banishment and then, without apology, speak of his wife and his son. The Bible is not confused. It is severe enough to say that sin does not cancel history. Human beings continue to marry, bear children, name places, fashion tools, compose songs, plant fields, raise animals, and wound each other all at once. Civilization does not wait until the soul is healed. Cain's fear that whoever finds me may kill him, Genesis 4:14, also begins to make practical sense in this eastward movement. By the time Cain departs, the family of Adam and Eve need not have been limited to the few names already mentioned. Genesis is highly selective. It introduces figures for theological and narrative reasons, not because they are the only people alive at each moment. Later the text will state plainly that after Seth was born, Adam had other sons and daughters, Genesis 5:4. That line is brief, but it is enough to widen the frame. The first household was larger than the short list preserved in the earliest scenes. This matters because Genesis does not owe us an exhaustive census before every narrative transition. Its purpose is covenantal and moral before it is encyclopedic. It names Abel because Abel's worship matters. It names Cain because Cain's violence matters. It names Seth because Seth's birth matters. The silence around others is not denial of their existence. It is narrative concentration. And that concentration can trouble modern readers, because we are trained to think that what is not spotlighted is absent. Genesis does not share that training. It can pass over decades in a verse. It can summarize generations with a cadence. It can tell you exactly what needs to be seen, without pretending to tell you everything that could be asked. So Cain goes east, and the world does not empty around him. A wife will appear in the text. A son will be born. A city will be named. Each detail is small when taken alone. Together they tell us that exile did not stop multiplication. It changed its atmosphere. The first murderer becomes, astonishingly, an ancestor. The first wanderer seeks permanence. The first brother killer fathers a child and names a city after him. Genesis 4:17. That is not redemption in the full sense. It is something more troubling and more familiar, the persistence of human life under judgment. We often prefer clearer categories. We want the wicked cast into immediate ruin and the righteous carried into visible peace. Genesis gives a world closer to ours than that. Cain lives long enough to build. His line will produce herdsmen, musicians, and metal workers. Genesis 4:20-22. Skill is not proof of innocence. Advancement is not the same as nearness to God. A culture may become ingenious while its conscience grows hard, but before the city, before the genealogy, before Lamech's bitter song, the text slips in one line that has occupied centuries of readers. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Genesis 4:17, no introduction, no ancestry attached, no explanation. The silence is deliberate enough to deserve respect. The woman the text does not name Genesis introduces Cain's wife with astonishing calm. It does not pause to defend her existence. It does not explain where she came from. It does not apologize for the questions that will arise centuries later. It simply states that Cain knew his wife, and she bore a son. Readers often stumble because the text does not stumble. We arrive with our modern habits of explicitness, our appetite for every connecting detail, and our suspicion that a missing explanation signals a contradiction. Genesis writes with another confidence. It assumes a world in which Adam and Eve's family is already broader than the named line of attention. It is not embarrassed by selectivity. The most immediate biblical clue stands in Genesis 5:4. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years. And he had other sons and daughters. The verse is not placed beside the Cain story, but it throws light backward. Adam and Eve did not produce only 3 sons. Their household expanded through daughters as well as sons, through births not individually recorded, through years far longer than those to which later generations are accustomed. When Cain takes a wife, the plainest reading within Genesis is that she comes from Adam's growing family, whether as a sister or, depending on the timeline one imagines, possibly a close niece from the next generation. That answer unsettles some readers because later biblical law forbids close-kin sexual unions, Leviticus 18. But Genesis is describing the beginning of the human race, not Israel in the wilderness. The conditions are not the same. The law at Sinai had not yet been given. Humanity stood near its origin, and if all people descend from Adam and Eve, then early kin marriage is not an embarrassing loophole in the story. It is a necessity built into the first generations. Scripture itself shows that later patriarchal history still includes marriages within extended family structures. Abraham says of Sarah, "She is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother." Genesis 20:12. Isaac marries within the broader kinship line, and Jacob does the same. These later examples are not identical to the first beginnings, but they remind the reader that the biblical world does not map neatly onto modern assumptions about family distance. The lines harden later, the prohibitions come later, the first household belongs to a different stage in the story. That does not make the subject light. Genesis never invites levity around human beginnings. It invites sobriety. The opening chapters are carrying the burden of origins, sin, death, and multiplication all at once. Cain's wife does not appear to satisfy curiosity. She appears because human history must continue, even through damaged people, even through families that already know shame. And here the unnamed daughters of Adam and Eve become impossible to ignore. The text names the sons who carry central narrative functions, but it does not deny the daughters. It simply does not stop to tell their stories one by one. That silence has often allowed readers to speak as if women stand at the edges of Genesis only when explicitly named. Yet from the moment Genesis 5:4 is read carefully, the illusion fails. Daughters were there, wives were there, mothers were there, sisters were there. Humanity did not spread through the named men alone. A household cannot become a people on masculine genealogy. Someone bore the children. Someone kept grief alive in private rooms while public lines were being traced through fathers and sons. Someone lived through the aftershocks of Cain and Abel, not as abstract theology but as family memory. This is why the question of Cain's wife is not trivial. It opens the door to a larger recognition. Genesis is full of necessary persons who are not given narrative prominence. The story is narrower on the page than it was in lived experience. The omission is not contempt, it is focus. Still, focus creates shadow, and shadow can make us forget what the text actually allows us to know. Pause here, because this matters beyond one question. When the Bible leaves someone unnamed, it has not declared that person unimportant. Often it has done the reverse. It has trusted the reader to understand that life is larger than the line of text, and that covenant history moves through many hands. The narrative does not catalogue individually. Some later traditions tried to relieve the pressure of this silence. The book known as Jubilees, a later Jewish retelling of early Genesis material, gives Cain's wife the name Awan and Seth's wife the name Azurah. That is not canonical scripture in most Jewish and Christian traditions, and it should not be quoted as though Genesis itself had provided the names. But the existence of such traditions is revealing. Readers close to the biblical world also felt the pull of the silence. They too wondered about the hidden persons who stood behind the compressed lines of Genesis. Still, the safest ground remains the canonical text. On that ground, we can say this much with confidence. Cain's wife is best understood as belonging to Adam and Eve's expanding family. Genesis permits that reading naturally. It does not need imported populations, unnamed parallel creations, or speculative of human races outside the line of Adam. Such ideas may arise from the discomfort of later readers, but the text itself does not require them. In fact, scripture elsewhere presses strongly toward a unified human origin. Paul says that God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. Acts 17:26. The theology of shared humanity rests better with the plain Genesis reading than with theories the text never introduces. The woman beside Cain remains unnamed in scripture, yet she is not unreal because she is unnamed. She is one of the first proofs that the Bible can move with disciplined silence while still speaking enough. She stands at the edge of the verse, and the whole future leans on her. Years no one counts. The first family lived in a world of long years. That is easy to say and difficult to feel. Adam lives 930 years, Genesis 5:5. Seth lives 912 years, Genesis 5:8. Enosh lives 905 years, Genesis 5:11. Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Methuselah, Lamech, again and again the numbers stretch beyond ordinary imagination in Genesis 5. Enoch alone breaks the rhythm in a different way, walking with God and being taken, Genesis 5:24. The chapter sounds like a tolling bell. Lived, fathered, lived more years, had sons and daughters and died. Yet within that cadence, the scale of early human overlap becomes visible. If Adam lived centuries, And if he has sons and daughters beyond those named, then the practical difficulty often raised about Cain's wife begins to shrink. Time, in early Genesis, is not moving by our cramped expectations. The text allows for households to widen, for generations to overlap, for siblings, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren to be alive within the span of a single patriarch's life. When Cain departs, the world need not contain only the 4 or 5 names most recently mentioned. This does not solve every chronological detail, because Genesis does not give a date for Abel's death relative to all later births. But the problem is often sharper in modern imagination than in the text itself. We read the briefness of the narration and assume the brevity of elapsed time. Genesis does not make that assumption. It can hold years in a clause. There is another reason the long years matter. They deepen the emotional burden of the story. Adam does not merely lose one son and then fade quickly from history. Eve does not bury Abel and pass from the scene within a decade. They live on. They live long enough to see houses rise, children multiply, lines diverge, worship weakened in some places and renewed in others. They live with memory over centuries. That is a severe mercy. Long life means long witness. Adam, who once knew the garden, sees a world that must now work bronze and iron east of Eden. Eve, who heard the sentence over pain in childbearing, watches daughters and granddaughters carry that sentence in their bodies generation after generation. Whatever else the long ages signify, they make history press personally upon its first participants. And in those years, daughters are born. Genesis 5:4 does not give us their number. It does not tell us the order of their births, the shape of their personalities, or the households they formed. Yet one short line, other sons and daughters, is enough to tell us that the first human community was never as sparse as many retellings make it. The line of named men is the skeleton of the chapter, but life requires more than skeleton. There were voices not recorded, marriages not chronicled individually, babies not named in the surviving narrative, griefs carried in kitchens and fields and tents, reconciliations partial and failed, acts of care performed without memorial. The Bible's compression can tempt us to imagine a nearly empty earth. But Genesis presents something different. A growing human world, thin at first, and then thickening through generations, through long lifespans, through repeated childbirth, through the stubborn continuance of family after catastrophe. This is also where Cain's fear of other avengers becomes more intelligible. Whoever finds me will kill me. Genesis 4:14 sounds less strange once we remember that many years may have passed, and the family may already have spread well beyond the immediate household circle preserved in the earlier verses. Abel's death did not occur in a vacuum. It rippled through kin. The emotional reality here is heavy. Cain did not merely wrong a brother in abstraction. He created a vacancy in a widening family system. Every later gathering carried absence. Every retelling carried accusation, whether spoken or silent. Every sister who remembered Abel remembered Cain as well. There is a paragraph hidden inside Genesis that Scripture never writes out in full, but history forces us to hear it. Daughters of Adam and Eve grew up in the shadow of 2 brothers, one buried and one marked. Some would have married into households shaped by that wound. Some would have mothered children who asked why one uncle was never present and why another lived east. Some would have learned the history of the family not as doctrine, but as damaged inheritance. The text stays spare, but the human pressure is enormous. A reflective reading of Genesis must resist 2 opposite mistakes. One mistake is to inflate the hidden details into confident fiction, speaking as though we know names, motives, conversations, and timelines Scripture does not give. The other mistake is to flatten the hidden details out of existence, pretending that only the named men mattered. Wisdom stands between. It honors the limit of the text and the fullness of life beneath the text. So when the question returns, who was Cain's wife? The answer does not require strain. She was almost certainly one of the women born in Adam's line, one of the daughters the text acknowledges without individually naming. The silence around her is not evidence against her. It is one more example of Genesis choosing its emphasis, and the emphasis is not romance. It is continuity after rupture. A house under exile, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Genesis 4:17. There is more ache in that verse than appears at first glance. Cain, sentenced to wandering, becomes a builder. A man told that the ground will resist him seeks permanence in walls, in streets, in the naming of place. He cannot return to Eden, so he establishes something east of it. He cannot recover his brother, so he extends his line through a son. He cannot remove the mark, so he plants legacy around it. This is one of the great ironies of early Genesis. Human beings do not stop building because they are estranged from God. Often they build more urgently. Loss can drive architecture. Shame can drive achievement. Fear can drive settlement. A city may rise partly from hope and partly from refusal to remain exposed. We should be careful here. The text does not say that building a city is itself Cain's sin. Cities are not cursed by definition. Later in Scripture, Jerusalem will be beloved. The new Jerusalem will descend in splendor from God. Revelation 21:2. The issue is not bricks alone. It is the heart inside the walls. Cain's city is introduced as a human effort at continuity under exile. It is both understandable and haunted. And within that city stands a household founded by a woman the text does not name. How did life feel inside such a house? Scripture does not tell us directly, so we must walk with restraint. But some truths are secure. Cain's wife shared the cost of his sentence without having personally committed his crime. She lived beside a man who carried divine protection and divine judgment at once. She bore a son into a line that began with blood in a field. Whatever tenderness existed in that home, it existed under history. Whatever ordinary rhythms they developed, food prepared, children soothed, mornings begun, nights endured, unfolded beneath a memory no architecture could seal out. This is one place where Genesis becomes quietly severe toward easy moral simplifications. The wife of Cain is not presented as a mere device for solving a population puzzle. She is a person whose life becomes bound to the consequences of a man's sin. That pattern will recur across Scripture and across history. One person transgresses, others learn the cost. Sin does not remain private. It radiates through households. Yet she is also part of humanity's refusal to disappear. Through her, children are born. Through her, the story does not collapse into sterile judgment. Through her, Cain's line acquires faces, work, names, and future. This is not approval of Cain. It is testimony to the strange resilience of creation after the fall. There is a hard tenderness in that. The city named Enoch is the first city in Scripture, and it arrives under tension. A murderer builds it. A son gives it its name. The desire for permanence answers the fear of wandering. But permanence cannot cleanse origin. No wall can unhear Genesis 4:10. Later in Cain's line come descendants whose work will shape human culture. Jabal will be the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. Jubal will be the father of those who play the lyre and pipe. Tubal-Cain will forge instruments of bronze and iron. Genesis 4:20-22. The line east of Eden becomes productive, inventive, and skilled. Human culture does not arise only from the line of obvious righteousness. It grows in mixed ground. This should sober every generation. Technical brilliance and moral nearness are not identical. A people may learn to build cities, handle metals, compose music, and organize labor while drifting further from reverence. Cultural development is real good in one sense, but it is not sufficient good. The hand may become more capable, while the heart becomes less supple. Cain's city stands at the beginning of that lesson, and yet the Bible does not deny the reality of its ordinary joys. Children still laugh before they understand genealogy. Bread still rises, hands still work. The first women of humanity still labor, nurse, grieve, mend, and age. A city is not only a symbol, it's also a place where actual persons live. Genesis gives us compressed history, but it does not flatten human texture into allegory. Cain's wife did not inhabit a thesis. She inhabited rooms, seasons, pregnancies, recoveries, and fears. That is why the question of Cain's wife is best answered morally as well as biologically. Yes, she was likely one of Adam's daughters or descendants within the first family. But beyond that, she was part of the first human attempt to keep living after the first murder. She belonged to the painful work of carrying history forward when no one in the world yet had experience with a wound like theirs. The Bible does not decorate her. It does not dismiss her. Either .ools, strings, and bronzer genealogies can look quiet on the page. In life they are never quiet. From Enoch came Irad, from Irad came Mehujael, from Mehujael came Methushael, and from Methushael came Lamech. Genesis 4:18. The names move quickly, but beneath them the world is changing. Herds expand, tents multiply, instruments sound hardens metal. Human skill branches outward. The line descending from Cain does not merely survive. It becomes formative in the visible structures of civilization. Jabal gives shape to mobile wealth and pastoral economy. Jubal gives shape to music. Tubal-Cain gives shape to metalworking. Genesis 4:20-22. These are not trivial developments. They mean human dominion over creation continues in fractured form. The image of God is damaged by sin, not erased. People still make. People still order matter. People still discover pattern, rhythm, pressure, and possibility in the world God made. This is where simplistic preaching can fail the text. If we speak as though Cain's descendants produced only evil, we do not honor Genesis. If we speak as though cultural progress proves moral health, we do not honor Genesis either. Scripture makes the harder claim. Fallen people remain capable of real cultural accomplishment, and cultural accomplishment can coexist with spiritual deterioration. Then Lamech speaks, and the line's internal condition becomes clearer. Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. Genesis 4:23-24. The song is brief, proud, and chilling. Cain murdered in secrecy and answered God with evasion. Lamech sings of his violence in public and magnifies vengeance as personal doctrine. Sin has become articulate. What crouched at Cain's door now stands in Lamech's mouth as boast. And notice where the speech is directed, to his wives. The household hears the creed of violence. Domestic space becomes theater for self-exaltation. The cultural line that can manage livestock, music, and metallurgy also produces a man who celebrates retaliatory bloodshed. Skill did not save the conscience. It furnished the world in which the conscience hardened. This is one of Genesis's most penetrating observations. Human flourishing in one register can coincide with human corruption in another. A lyre can be played in a violent household. Bronze can be forged by a people who no longer tremble before God. Civilization is not redemption. That is why the question of Cain's wife must eventually widen into the question of Cain's line. The woman who appears unnamed in Genesis 4:17 is not only part of an origin puzzle. She stands near the beginning of a family history that demonstrates both the power and the peril of human continuity east of Eden. Through that line, the world becomes more populated, more capable, more sonically alive, more technically adept, and, in the case of Lamech, more openly proud in violence. We should not miss the women in this section either. Ada and Zillah are named, unlike Cain's wife. Yet they are addressed inside a man's violent self-display. The text gives them presence but not speech. Even here, women occupy the intimate radius of decisions they do not appear to control. The line of Cain is not merely a list of men doing public things. It is a network of households, in which wives and children absorb the moral weather set by male action. Still, Genesis is too careful to let the story become a simple tale of one wholly dark family and one wholly pure future line. Human lives are not that neat. The sons of Cain create tools humanity will continue to use. Music itself is not condemned because Jubal came from Cain's line. The point is subtler and more searching. Gifts can survive in corrupted houses because God's common grace continues to operate in the world, even where saving nearness is not foregrounded. That common grace should humble the proud and warn the naive. We benefit every day from the labor of people whose hearts are not aligned with God. We build with inherited knowledge that passed through mixed hands. Genesis saw this before empires existed. Yet the line of Cain also becomes a warning about self-made permanence. The farther we travel from the first field, the more polished the descendants may become. But polish is not healing. Lamech proves that sophistication can arrive alongside intensified moral darkness. The violence has not disappeared. It has learned meter. This is why Genesis 4 cannot be read as a simple answer to historical curiosity. It is diagnosing civilization at birth. A city rises, music sounds, metal glows, and vengeance sings. The unnamed wife at the beginning of the line belongs to all of this. Her children's children help fill the earth. Their work matters. Their moral direction matters more. Another son Genesis does not allow Cain's line to have the last word. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. Genesis 4:25. The verse is one of the gentlest and saddest in early scripture. Eve's speech does not pretend Abel was replaceable. Seth is not Abel restored, the wound remains. But the line of blessing has not closed. The name Seth carries appointment, placing grant. Eve receives him as given, not manufactured. The mother of the first murdered son speaks again, and her words are framed not by denial of grief, but by recognition of God's action within grief. She does not say the loss no longer matters. She says God has appointed another seed in Abel's place. That word seed has deep resonance because Genesis has already taught the reader to hear it. In Eden, after the serpent's deception and the human fall, the Lord declared that the seed of the woman would bruise the serpent's head, though the serpent would bruise his heel. Genesis 3:15. The promise was mysterious then. It remains mysterious now, but Seth's birth allows the family to breathe under it again. The story of humanity will not end in Cain's field. This does not mean Seth begins life untouched by the family's history. He is born into a house that knows too much. Adam and Eve have buried one son and endured the exile of another. The first lullabies after Abel are not sung by parents who still think the world innocent. Seth enters a humanity already wounded and already dying. Yet he also enters as a sign that God has not withdrawn the future. After Seth comes Enosh, and at that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Genesis 4:26. That sentence should not be pressed into meaning that no one had ever worshipped truly before, since Abel's offering was already accepted. It is better understood as indicating a renewed or public pattern of invocation, a marked emergence of worshipping identity in Seth's line. The text sets it beside Cain's city and Lamech's boast deliberately. One line becomes known for technological and social development under deepening violence. The other becomes marked by calling on the Lord, Agon. Genesis is not childish about this contrast. The line of Seth is not portrayed as sinless. Later chapters will make painfully clear that wickedness spreads broadly across humanity before the flood, Genesis 6:5. But the distinction still matters. In Seth's line, worship is foregrounded, dependence is named. A future remains open for covenant memory. This is where the hidden daughters belong again. Seth does not stand alone in preserving the human future. Nor does Enosh. Lines are traced through named sons, because that is the genealogical convention of the text. But every such line depends upon women carrying children, bearing pain, sustaining households, teaching speech, transmitting memory, and holding together the daily life in which worship either survives or thins out. A brief verse can hide generations of female labor. We should not romanticize that labor. Genesis itself will not let us. Childbearing occurs under pain, Genesis 3:16. Work occurs under toil, Genesis 3:17-19. Family life occurs under sin. The daughters of Adam and Eve did not inhabit a soft world simply because they lived near the beginning. They inhabited a world where the first pages of history already contained exile, sweat, blame, murder, and graves. And yet, in that world, Seth is born. In that world, Eve still speaks hope. In that world, the name of the Lord is called upon. That combination matters for the entire question of Cain's wife. The mystery of the unnamed women cannot be solved merely by chronology. It must be placed within the theological movement of Genesis. Cain's line shows survival, culture, and escalating violence. Seth's line shows appointed continuity and renewed invocation. Both lines require daughters, wives, mothers. One line is narrated through the city, the other through worship. Both are human. Only one is presented as carrying the promise forward in the structure of the book. A small paragraph belongs here. God did not forget the house. The text is too disciplined to say more than it should, but it says enough. Abel is dead, Cain is east, Seth is given. The promise is not loud, but it is still breathing. The daughters of the first house, Genesis, names Eve. Genesis names Cain, Abel, Seth. Then, in one compact phrase, it opens a door that readers too often leave shut. Adam had other sons and daughters. Genesis 5:4. The daughters are not decorative. They are not an afterthought in the human project. They are the human project as surely as the sons are. If humanity truly comes from this first pair, then every expansion of household, every marriage, every pregnancy, every new cluster of kin in the generations nearest the beginning depended upon the daughters of Adam and Eve. The question is not whether they mattered. The question is why readers have so easily allowed genealogical style to hide their importance. Part of the answer lies in how biblical genealogies work. They are not modern demographic reports. They are selective, theological, and often organized around lines of inheritance, promise, priesthood, kingship, or covenant continuity. A genealogy may name the one necessary son, through whom the narrative will proceed while assuming the existence of many others. It may compress entire lifetimes into a pattern. It may prioritize those who carry a public line without denying the many who made that line possible. But a literary pattern can become a spiritual blindfold if we do not read with care. The daughters of Adam and Eve would have lived at the center of the earliest human burdens. They would have grown up hearing the story of Eden, not as remote doctrine, but as family memory. Their parents had known the garden. Their parents had heard the serpent. Their parents had been clothed by God after disobedience. Genesis 3:21. No later generation could say that of father and mother. The daughters would also have lived under the sharpened pain of childbirth announced in Genesis 3:16. Every labor would have been both ordinary and covenantally haunted. Another reminder that life continued under judgment and mercy together. Then there is the matter of grief. The first sisters of humanity, whether born before or after Abel's death, belong to a family permanently rearranged by violence. Some readers ask only the technical question: if Cain had a wife, where did she come from? And miss the emotional truth standing behind it. She came from a house that had already buried a son. She came from parents who had learned that one child can lift a hand against another. She came from a world where human trust was already scarred. That should change the tone in which the question is asked. The daughters also complicate the idea that early Genesis is mainly about men shaping history, while women remain passive background. The text may not narrate each daughter's actions in sequence, but the practical reality is unmistakable. Without them, no multiplication, Without them, no Cainite households, no Sethite households, no grandchildren filling the spaces between the named verses. Without them, the command to be fruitful and multiply would stop in theory. Their bodies carried history. Their labor made genealogy possible. Some later readers have felt the pull of this hidden reality strongly enough to preserve names in tradition. As noted earlier, the Book of Jubilees supplies names such as Awan for Cain's wife and Azura for Seth's wife. These names do not carry canonical authority equal to Genesis, and we must not smuggle them into Scripture as if Moses had written them. Still, their preservation tells us something honest about biblical reception. Attentive communities knew the text had left human lives implied, rather than fully narrated, and they sought to imagine the margins. There is value in noticing that impulse, provided it remains subordinate to the biblical text. Tradition may witness to the hunger readers feel. It may not override the limits God has chosen for Scripture. A reflective reader should ask why Genesis remains so spare here. One answer is that the opening chapters are doing foundational theological work. They are tracing creation, fall, judgment, murder, preservation, and the beginning of two distinguishable lines in human history. To include every daughter and every domestic detail would change the genre and the focus. Genesis is not careless, it is concentrated, yet concentration has a cost. It demands readers who will remember what a short phrase still contains. And here is what that phrase contains. Girls born into a world near its beginning, women carrying pregnancies across unusually long years, sisters remembering Abel, relatives connected to Cain despite his exile, mothers in both the line of Cain and the line of Seth, elderly daughters becoming ancestors of tribes whose names Scripture never records, women standing at the threshold of fields, tents, city gates, cradles, and graves long before Israel exists as a people. If we cannot name them, we can at least refuse to think of them as negligible. This also answers an unspoken moral concern in the question of Cain's wife. Some readers recoil because the earliest marriages must have been between close relatives if humanity descends from one pair. But the discomfort partly arises because we imagine a faceless biological mechanism rather than actual households shaped by divine command, unusual longevity, and the first conditions of human propagation. Genesis is not presenting these unions as late-stage decadence. It is presenting them as first-stage necessity in a world not yet governed by the later covenantal boundaries of Leviticus 18. The daughters were not an awkward footnote to the story. They were the only possible path by which the story could spread outward. And still Scripture does not name them. That silence has a chastening effect. We like to think we honor importance by recording it exhaustively. God sometimes honors importance by making it structurally indispensable, even when it is not narratively centered. The daughters of Adam and Eve are indispensable in precisely that way. They are hidden beams in the architecture of Genesis. One day, much later in Scripture, a genealogy will open the Gospel of Matthew and deliberately include certain women by name: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth the wife of Uriah, and Mary. Matthew 1:3-16. That genealogy feels striking, partly because so much genealogical writing had taught readers to expect compression. The selective naming of women in Matthew works because women were always there, always carrying the history forward, whether or not every generation listed them. The daughters of the first house belong to that deeper pattern. Their names are absent, their work is everywhere.